All right. Well, welcome to the podcast. Dave Frank, how are you doing today?
Doing really well. Really well. How about you?
I am doing good. I'm doing good. Just like we were
Nice.
chatting a little bit before we hit record, just kind of stepping into embracing summer and that whole like working from home while you have kids off of school and just kind of rolling with it, kind of enjoying it sometimes. Sometimes it's a little stressful, but for the most part, I'm enjoying it.
Yeah, that's awesome. I love summer. I think it's my favorite. And today is actually the summer solstice, so
Oh
that's
yeah,
exciting.
that's right. That's right. I forgot about that. Awesome. Well, why don't we start our conversation? Today we're going to be talking about the psychology of money. So I'm curious to pick your brain and kind of hear what you have to say about that. But why don't you start us off with letting us know a little bit about who you are, what you do, and I always love to hear people's stories. How did you get started doing what you're doing today?
Yeah, happy to. So my name's David Frank. I'm the founder, owner, lead financial planner of Turning Point Financial Planning. And what that is a financial planning service designed specifically for therapists in private practice, both solo practitioners and group practice owners. And so, what I do is really help therapists navigate every essential element of their financial life, whether that shows up on the professional side in their practice or whether that shows up on the personal side in their personal finances. And of course, they are very intermingled as they are for
Yeah.
virtually every small business owner that I've ever spoken with. So navigating the distinction between the two is something that comes up all the time, and just
Hmm.
making sure that things are kind of on the right track and helping people make decisions with sort of like less anxiety and worry and uncertainty, and just helping folks feel like they are on the right track. So that's the general overview of what I do. And how I got into it is sort of an interesting story. I think I've worked in finance in various capacities my entire career, which is somehow over 20 years now. I'm not quite sure how
Wow.
that happened, but it did.
It's crazy.
And yeah, I mean, it's just such a cliche that time goes by more
Yeah.
and more quickly, but it really does.
Yeah.
But I love, like, I'm a dork. I love numbers and spreadsheets and quantitative. Like yesterday, I was doing some algebra, and it was just to yeah, I won't even go down that path, but it was just like I got such a
So
kick out of
fun.
like
So fun.
it is weirdly fun for me, and so I
It's
enjoy
great.
doing that kind of work. And that was for that reason, my career's been a lot of fun. But I hit this point when I was about 40, and I thought, I like the tools that I'm using. I like what I'm doing, but I don't so much care for the mission that I'm serving by doing them. I was
Hmm.
working for a tech company at the time, and it wasn't bad. Like what it was like a good company. They were doing helpful and
Hmm.
important things. It just wasn't that resonant with me. And
Yeah.
I just really wanted to help people with this really important area of their life around money and finances. And so I went on this exploration of trying to start my own business and deciding who I was going to work with. And it took some time for me to figure that out. But as someone who's benefited tremendously myself from mental health services, I just finally stumbled upon serving therapists. And it just has felt like the moment it was actually suggested to me by a business coach I was working with. He's like, well, what
Hmm.
about like mental health professionals? And the
Hmm.
moment that he said that, it was not a light bulb moment. For me, it was more of a lightning bolt moment. It was
Yeah.
just like, it just was like, oh my God,
Yeah.
like so obviously the right decision. And I've never looked back since.
Yeah. That's awesome. And that I resonate with your story because I've got some sort of similarities kind of in my own
Mm.
in that like, I was working for a nonprofit that was doing great work in the world and, nothing
Yeah,
wrong with what they were doing, but I just didn't feel fulfilled in the work that I was doing within the work that they were doing. And so that was kind
totally.
of why I stepped out and have kind of always wanted to be a little bit closer to the work that's really meaningful for me. So kind of similar. And My wife's a therapist. That's kind of how I landed into the mental health world. But
Right.
again, similar to you, when I kind of landed on that, it was just like, oh yeah, like I could serve this community forever. Like this is amazing. So very cool.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, why don't let's get into our topic. So, we were kind of, emailing back and forth on, what we want to talk about. One of the topics you presented was about the psychology of money and money mindset. And, that's a topic that I always come back to. It's something that we have
Yeah.
spoken about before or I've written about. But it's always just such a good conversation, because it's
Yeah,
these things that so many people can relate to, especially as business owners. And for
absolutely.
me, I didn't realize all of the hangups and poor mindsets that I had around money until I started my own business. Um, so where do we start
Yep.
with this big this big conversation about our money mindset and psychology of money?
Yeah, I think it's such a great point that I think it's funny the way you were kind of describing it in terms of it's something that eventually, sooner or later, we all become aware of that, oh, wow, I have this relationship with money.
Yeah,
And I think that goes unnoticed for the majority of people for a big part of their life. And even within the mental health community, obviously we work with therapists, even though we aren't therapists. And just like the communities we're in, of course, we're thinking about feelings and emotions and like these
yeah,
relationships and like the internal stories and all this stuff all the time. But money can be such a blind spot. And I think there's a lot of reasons for that. Perhaps one of the biggest ones is just it's kind of a social taboo in our culture. And there's actually been studies done. I don't know that there's been a new one done, but there was this study that just said, in general, people would be much more willing to have a conversation about their sex life with, in public with other folks relative to their financial life. And I think
mm,
there's just so much going on in our financial lives in terms of, big surprise, like so much of it comes from our money mindset comes from childhood and our
yeah,
families of origin and what happened there and how money was talked about, or in more cases, how money was not talked about,
yeah,
but still was very much present a lot of times, even if, it was sort of like the name that no one spoke about.
yeah,
So I think like the first step is just sort of no, it's really just kind of noticing and just being like, hey, what is going on? Like, what is coming up for me? And I completely identify with what you said around you don't necessarily know what's going on with your relationship to money as clearly. Like nothing will
hmm
make it more clear than starting a business.
yeah,
And then all of a sudden, so much stuff gets stirred up. And like we all have stuff. So
yeah,
it's just sort of about like, okay, this isn't, I think the one of the most important things to remember is just to try and practice, and no one does this perfectly, but just sort of maintain a stance of curiosity and non-judgment around this
yeah,
stuff.
mm,
Because there is so much self-judgment and
yeah,
shame that comes up, and like a lot of I should or I shouldn't statements that we
yeah,
make to ourselves.
oh yeah,
And making those statements is completely understandable and human, right?
yeah.
And not terribly useful most of the time.
Yeah. Yeah. That I totally resonate with that should mindset. We a lot of the times, I can find myself in those cycles of I should be further along than I am now, or my business should
Oh,
be more successful, than
yep,
it is now. And I've been
yep.
just in my own journey. I recently read that book, 10x is easier than 2x. I'm not sure if you read that one.
I haven't,
Um,
but I've heard of it. Yeah.
Dan Sullivan. I forget. It's two authors. But great book, and you're talking about like growing and scaling your business and your life. And he talks a lot about living in the gap or living in the gain. And that was like on this topic
Right.
really resonated. Like when we live in the
Yes.
gap, we're thinking, oh, I should be further, or oh, that didn't go how I wanted it to with that client, or oh, I lost another client, and you're kind of living in sort of that lack mentality instead of thinking about, the gain is like, well, 7 years ago, whatever it is, I quit my job and I stepped out and I started a business. And
Yep.
I had one client. This is me personally. I had one client when I started my business, which probably wasn't the smartest thing, and here I am, and we've got a waiting list of clients now. It's like you're looking at more of like where you've come from and what you've built, relevant to your business or your finances, whatever it is, instead of like getting caught up in that I should be here, I should be there. Like, who's to say you should be anywhere? Like
Yeah.
you've obviously if you've built a business, you've taken risks, you've kind of conquered a lot. So focus more on that rather than those shoulds. But yeah,
Yeah.
the shoulds get us all the time.
Yeah. Yeah. It's, yeah, I forgot about this gap in the gain concept. A friend of mine who's actually a realtor was the first one who mentioned that concept to me, and it really resonated with me as well. Like, are you living in the gap or the gain? And I think, it ties back to something that I'm sure we're all familiar with, which is just sort of, being more in gratitude and reminding ourselves of all that we have
Yeah.
grateful, all that we have to be grateful for, all
Yeah.
that we have accomplished. And it is just, I was going to say it's a quirk of our psychology as humans, but I think it's more of like a designed feature, really, that's we focus on the negative. We focus
Yeah.
on what there is to be worried about. Just that's our natural disposition. And I think
Yeah.
it makes sense because it's like, okay, that's what we need to work on. That's what we need to improve. Those are the actions that we need to take.
Yeah.
And like it's important though, just to manage our mindset and just to manage our psychology and just to kind of like manage our mood, even, and just like our overall mental health. It's so important to just say, what am I grateful for? What have I accomplished?
Yeah.
And I love your framing of kind of zooming out. Like when you're in your own
Hmm.
business, whatever your business looks like, whatever your practice looks like, when you're living in that gap, so to speak, or you're focused on the problems and, the shoulds or whatnot,
Yeah.
usually you're very zoomed in one
Right.
particular thing of what's
Yeah.
happening now, or like what's happening in one particular area of work or business or life. And so what I always encourage my clients to do is when we're talking about that, and that's what I have conversations about, is like typically what's going wrong, or not
Hmm.
wrong, but what could be improved a little bit.
Yeah.
It's just like, okay, and let's zoom out and just, see like look at all that you've accomplished.
Yeah.
It's really important. And honestly, it is difficult to do sometimes without another person there. Like being in conversation about things, I
Hmm.
think just can be really powerful because just like that simple act of taking it out of your head and verbalizing it with another human
Hmm.
being, like it can help things shift so much. Um,
Yeah.
and like we all know that, right? Like it's just
Yeah.
like, we all know that, but it's just
Yeah.
like we forget, you just kind
Yeah.
of forget.
And that ties back to what you said about kind of, our upbringing and how people maybe don't want to talk about money. And so I think it's so helpful, to your point about getting it out and talking. It's so helpful to have those people that you can do that with, and you have like a mastermind group or another colleague
Yeah.
that you consult with, and you're comfortable enough to be like, hey, last month we did this in my business, and that's our worst month that we've had, and kind of like getting
Mm,
emotions coming back from the other person that believes in you, and helps you kind of
yeah.
get your head out of just being so hyper focused on, oh, I just had my worst month ever, and it takes, to me, I think it takes the power away from just seeing that, oh, it's
Absolutely.
been the worst month ever. And yeah, like you said, it just gets it on the outside, gets it out of you, and just, I think it disrupts that story that you tell yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. I think so much of that is really critical. And when you were talking, it just reminded me of the fact that, shame can't live if you sort
Hmm.
of expose it to sunlight and like
Yeah.
share what's going on. It's like when we keep those secrets, that's when it can become rather poisonous. And I think it's
Yeah.
really, really important, especially as business owners, as practice owners, to find those people, to find your team, so to speak, whether
Yeah.
that is just peers that you can share with honestly, whether it's also hiring professionals that you can, have a collaborative relationship with, and just kind of experimenting with it and figuring out like who does need to be on your team for this phase or this season of life, and this phase or season of
Yeah.
practice ownership, and just figuring out what works with you. I think it is, I had an experience just like a couple of years ago where, like the should voices were coming up, and like, I should be better at X, Y, and Z. I should be further along in my business than I am. And it's really easy to sort of get down on yourself, or at least I found it was pretty easy to get
Yeah.
down on myself for a period of time.
Hmm.
And luckily I have a lot of friends and colleagues who are in the same business as me, and I could have some conversations with them. And I also have my own financial planner for the reason that, I want someone else involved in my money stuff who isn't me, who doesn't live
Yeah.
between my two ears, just
Yeah.
so I'm forced to talk about it. And
Hmm.
I think some shame kind of creeped in for me. Those voices of I should, like sort of became shame because like I wasn't sharing it with anyone. And when I
Yeah.
finally talked to my financial planner about it, he was able to say, this just isn't that big of a deal.
Mm.
It's just like, oh, you're kind of getting to that point where you just feel like, oh, I should probably give up. I should
Right.
probably just like realize
Mm.
I'm not cut out to be a business owner,
Mm.
and I should just, fold everything and go find a job to work at. And he's just like, oh, okay, so you're hitting that point. Everyone hits that point, by the way. Maybe
Hmm.
not everyone, but it's super, super common. And
Yeah.
it's just, I think I knew that, but I had forgotten it. And just
Yeah.
having someone there to remind me of something that probably was fairly obvious
Yeah.
was incredibly powerful and helpful.
Yeah, it's super common. I have a running joke with my wife, maybe like once a quarter. I say I'm just gonna sell the business and I'm gonna become a garbage man and just have my headphones on and just ride in the
Yeah.
back of the garbage truck and I
Yeah.
know exactly what I'm gonna do each day. It's
Yep.
it's it's yeah, it's totally joking. I love what I do, but everyone's gonna hit those points or have those days or have those
Absolutely.
weeks or you're tackling so much as a business owner. If you're managing a team, there's even more complications and more nuances,
Absolutely.
all that stuff. So I love what you're saying just about like, getting it out, getting into the open so that shame can't really continue to fester and grow.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's really important. And something else you said just sort of jogged my memory of what's also really helped me is like I just like the concept of holding things more loosely
Yeah.
in terms of work and business and finances as well. I think like sometimes we can get so rigid and cling to things so tightly of
Yeah.
things have to work out, like this has to happen or this like I need certainty and security in all things, especially when it comes to money and finances.
Yeah.
And for better or for worse, there simply is no such thing.
Yeah.
There just isn't. There's a lot of people out there that will try to sell you on their ability to provide you security and certainty.
Yeah.
And that is almost always a red flag of,
Hmm.
okay, like, because life is life. Like there
Yeah.
just is no certainty. Like I don't know what's
Yeah.
going to happen with the election this year. I don't know what's going to happen with the economy. I don't know what's going to happen with my health, your health, anyone's health. Like, I don't know what's going to happen longer term with the environment, right? Like these are all
Yeah.
risks that we just are exposed to, and there literally is nothing we can do about most of them. So I think
Yeah.
it's just sort of about like living in that uncertainty and being okay with it. And to our earlier point, finding the right people to include in our lives so that we can talk about that uncertainty and the discomfort we have with uncertainty, because as
Yeah.
humans, we all have discomfort with
Right.
uncertainty, just to normalize it and just be like, hey, you know what? Like I got to the point finally where I was like, because especially starting your own business, it's like, oh, this is your livelihood, right? Like this,
Mm.
like your whole financial security and that's what money is tied to a lot of times is like safety and security.
Yeah.
So when our money life, our financial life feels at risk, that can hook into some really powerful drives in terms of providing for ourselves and those that we care about.
Yeah.
And it can get really scary and it can get really overwhelming.
Yeah, yeah. It sounds like you are a financial therapist. It sounds like you're providing a lot of guidance for your clients. I bet you have a lot of conversations, huh?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's a really interesting point because there is an emerging field of financial therapy. So
Yeah,
literally, licensed mental health professionals who are specializing in the financial area, in the money area.
yeah,
And certainly, I do a lot of coaching and perhaps therapeutic conversations with
right.
clients. Um, and that's always a part of it. But like it always comes up, and it's not infrequent that like just like money mindset stuff comes up. It's just like, oh, I couldn't possibly like raise rates or change compensation for my staff or whatever. and usually, we'll bump up against stuff.
Hmm.
And sometimes I'll just be like, we can absolutely have a conversation about it. And I do with a lot of clients. It's just like, well, let's just sort of talk this through. And we usually start to sort of uncover some stuff. And it's just great to be
Yeah.
aware of it and to know like,
Hmm.
oh, this is stuff from my past that's coming up. And a lot of times I'll say, like, this would be an amazing thing for you to have a conversation with your therapist about. And then like,
Yeah.
let me know how it goes,
Yeah.
like, because it doesn't tend to go away. It's not like we identify it and then it's like, sweet, never going to be an issue again. It's just
Yeah,
like
right. I wish.
things come around again and again, wearing slightly different disguises sometimes.
Right.
Um, yeah,
Yeah.
it's
Yeah. It's fascinating to me though, just
yeah,
like just how there's so much going on in between our ears that we're not fully aware of. And then that, like you said, you're walking through uncertainty and it brings it up in different ways. And really step one, kind of go back to the beginning of this conversation, is just really being aware of what's going on and aware of your emotions tied to those situations that come up. One of your team members quits, or
yeah,
yeah, or you have an issue with a client and they're not going to continue with you. Like, what does that stir up for you and why? And then kind of moving to our next, part of our conversation is finding someone to talk to about that and really get curious and explore through it. Otherwise, you're just going to be on those continual cycles of like fight or flight, freeze, all that stuff.
yeah, yeah, exactly. And I think it's like such a great point that, you know, things in life, like in business, is just a part of life, right? Like dealing with
Hmm.
finances is just a part of life. So in life, things are going to happen that are going to kind of trigger us emotionally. And like the real challenge and the opportunity, I think, is to sort of just kind of stay with it. I
Hmm.
think the danger zone is when we get close to something that trigger us, is just like, we react to it. And it's just like,
Yeah.
get me away from this as quickly as possible. I don't want to look at this. I don't want to deal with this. I don't want to feel these feelings,
Yeah.
is really typically what's happening.
Yeah.
And the opportunity and the challenge is just sort of to sit there and just
Hmm.
sort of be like, okay, sometimes like what say with clients, like a lot of times, and it was just like, we'll be discussing something that's happened that was like a challenge or didn't go the way they had hoped. And a lot of times I half jokingly will say, like, and that didn't kill you. That's really helpful feedback,
Hmm.
right? Like nothing like, oh, that sucked. And nothing all that terrible happened. And we
Right.
learned a little bit a little bit about
Hmm.
the world, a little bit about your business, a little bit about yourself. And so now how do we move forward with that?
Yeah.
Um, and that is the work, on a somewhat related subject. Like a lot of the work I do is like helping clients invest for their future, save for retirement, paying for college for their kids, or whatever you want your money to do in the future. And oftentimes, an element of that overall financial plan will be investing in things outside of your business, things like
Hmm.
through a retirement plan or a different investment account. And what I always say, like that, when you're investing in the stock market for the long term, there's a lot to know and to think about when doing that. But there's a little bit of knowledge you want to get. And then the real work of investing is to just sit there and not be reactive to what's
Yeah.
happening in the headlines, in the
Hmm.
financial press, and just the media in general, which can be really scary.
Yeah.
Because in general, folks are really, investors are rewarded for kind of what we say, staying in your seats. So
Yeah.
like figuring out what the appropriate investment strategy is for you and then sticking to it. And
Yeah.
that sticking to it is the real work, because things will get scary sooner or later. There will be a financial crisis, there will be a pandemic, there will be, I don't know what.
Yeah.
And it is inevitably going to happen where you're going to hit this point where it looks really bad. And I probably should sell all of my investments and get out of the market. And there's no guarantees of life. So we don't know for sure what's going to
Right.
happen. But when we look back at the past 100+ years, it's just like the best thing to do is nothing. So the real work is to sit there with
Yeah.
your emotions, with your feelings,
Yep.
and do nothing.
Yeah.
And that is the most difficult thing to
Hmm.
do, right? Like, how
Right.
can such stuff, how can bad things be happening, scary things be happening? And the
Yeah.
recommended course of action is just to sit here and do nothing. Super counterintuitive.
Right. I think that's probably a good place to land our conversation is just do nothing. That'll be the bumper sticker for this conversation is do
Yeah,
nothing. But I think that really does tie it all together, just kind of back to looking at ourselves and the stories we're telling ourselves, and that it's not so much about what you do in each scenario that comes your way, because like you said, we don't know what's going to happen day in, day out, seasons and time. But one thing that we do have control over is how we respond, how we respond
that's
to
right.
those situations. So yeah, this is a great conversation, Dave. I really appreciate it. And this is kind of a good segue right now too. Why don't you tell us just a little bit more about your business, services you offer? I know you kind of touched on that a little bit, and where people can find you.
Yeah. So the best place to find me is probably on my website. I'm also on LinkedIn, so you can find me there. But my website is turningpointhq.com. So HQ, like the abbreviation for headquarters, turningpointhq.com. I've got a bunch of free resources on there, freebies that I give away just to help you manage like what I work on folks with, which is every aspect of your financial life, both within your practice and on the personal side. And the services that I offer are, I offer financial planning services to therapists, and so that's something that can be a bit nebulous. Just like, well, what all does that encompass? And it does encompass a lot. So it's really kind of having a thought partner, like someone to talk to some of the things we've been having in this conversation about. So
Hmm.
I really encourage folks to go to the website and just start poking around. There's like a lot of blog articles, a lot of things you can learn, and that'll help you kind of understand, hey, is this all these different areas? Would it be the right time for me to explore having someone in my life on the professional side to help me? And if that's something you're interested in, you can schedule a free initial consultation appointment through my website, and then we'll just have a relaxed conversation about what's going on for you, what's coming up, and how you'd like to move forward. So yeah, that's the
Yeah.
little spiel about me.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, thanks so much, David. Really appreciate your time. And it's great hanging out with you. I appreciated
Likewise.
meeting you for the first time at Meet You in
Yeah,
Kentucky, and always excited to meet people who are just providing great resources for this community, and just great work. Really appreciate you.
yeah. Thanks so much. It's been fun.